The day Edith Bishop arrived in Colton Creek, Texas, the summer of 1882, the entire town stopped breathing for just a moment, because no woman who looked like trouble wrapped in calico had ever stepped off that stage with quite so much fire in her eyes and so little money in her purse. She stood on the cracked wooden planks of the stage platform with a single leather trunk at her feet and a carpetbag clutched against her chest, squinting into the brutal afternoon sun as if she were daring it to blink first. The heat pressed down on everything in Colton Creek like a flat iron on wet cloth. The dust rose in lazy spirals from the street below, and somewhere down the main road, a dog barked twice and then gave up. It was that kind of a town that had given up on most things and hadn't quite figured out that it ought to at least pretend otherwise. Edith was 24 years old, with dark hair pinned under a brown felt hat and green eyes that had seen enough disappointment to make a weaker woman sit down and never stand back up. She had come from Missouri, from a family that no longer had any use for her now that her father had died, and her stepmother had made it abundantly clear that the farmhouse had room for only the people who could contribute to it. The stage ticket west had cost her almost everything she had left, and the advertisement she had answered in the St. Louis Gazette had promised her a position as a schoolteacher in Colton Creek, Texas, where the town was desperate for anyone educated enough to stand in front of a classroom and hold their ground. She had a degree of sorts, having studied under the county schoolmaster in Missouri for 4 years, and having read every book her father had owned, which amounted to a small but respectable collection. She knew mathematics and literature and enough history to fill a moderate-sized room. What she did not know was what she had walked into. The school board's representative, a round little man named Harold Pratt, met her at the platform with a handkerchief already pressed to his forehead and the look of a man who had been standing in the wrong spot for too long. "Miss Bishop," he said, extending a soft hand, "welcome to Colton Creek. I trust the journey was not entirely unbearable." "It was bearable," she said, shaking his hand with a firmness that made him blink. "Where is the schoolhouse?" He smiled the way men smiled when they were about to deliver news they didn't want to deliver. "Well now, there is the matter of a few details we ought to discuss first. You see, the schoolhouse is at this present moment in a state of some transition." "Transition," she repeated. "It burned down," he said, lowering his voice as though the building might be embarrassed. "6 weeks ago, lightning. We are in the process of rebuilding." Edith stared at him for a long moment. The sun continued to beat down. The dog down the street tried barking again and decided against it. "Where am I to stay while it is rebuilt?" she asked. "We have arranged a room for you at Mrs. Calloway's boarding house," he said quickly. "She is a decent woman, excellent cook, and the room is clean. Your salary will of course begin once school commences." "Of course," Edith said, with a tone that suggested she understood perfectly well what that meant. She picked up her carpetbag and waited for someone to help with her trunk. Harold Pratt looked at the trunk, looked at his own soft hands, and then waved down a young boy who was watching from across the street. The boy helped drag the trunk to Mrs. Calloway's, and Edith walked behind them through the main road of Colton Creek, taking in what would apparently be her new life. It was not much to look at. There was a general store, a barber shop, a saloon called the Red Lantern that looked like it had been built in a hurry and repaired in even more of a hurry, a land office, a small church at the far end of the road, and a livery stable that smelled exactly as one might expect a livery stable in Texas in August to smell. There were cattle pens at the edge of town, and beyond those, the land opened up into something so wide and so flat and so startlingly golden that it almost made Edith forget, for a brief second, that she was broke, alone, and in possession of a job that had not technically started yet. Mrs. Calloway's boarding house was a wide, 2-story structure that had once been painted white, and was now a sort of weathered cream, with a porch that wrapped around the front and a rocking chair on it that looked like it had a story of its own. The woman who met them at the door was 60 years old, iron-haired, and had the warmth of someone who had decided a long time ago that the world was hard enough without her adding to it. "Miss Bishop," she said, and took Edith's hands in both of hers. "Coming out of that heat, Lord above. Harold, put that trunk on the porch and Wallace will bring it up later. Come, dear, I have sweet tea." Edith followed her inside and was immediately grateful, because the inside of Mrs. Calloway's was cool and smelled of cedar and something baking, and it felt, for the first time in weeks, like somewhere a person might actually rest. She met the other boarders at supper that evening. There were 3 of them. A land surveyor named Mr. Gill, who spoke very little and ate very quickly. A widow named Mrs. Faraday, who had come to town to be near her son and seemed to have misplaced him. And a man who arrived late to the table, dropping into the chair across from Edith with the energy of someone who had been doing physical work all day and had only just remembered that sitting down was an option. His name was Clark Barnett, and when he looked up from pulling off his hat and dropping it on the empty chair beside him, his eyes met Edith's and something quiet happened in the air between them that neither of them acknowledged and both of them noticed. He was 30 years old, broad-shouldered and lean in the way that men who worked outdoors in Texas became lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that was carrying 2 days of stubble. He had brown eyes that were sharp without being unkind, and hands that were calloused and capable, the hands of a man who had been using them hard since he was a boy. He was wearing a plain cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and the dust of the day still on him, and he had the particular quality of someone who was entirely comfortable taking up space without needing to announce himself. "Clark," Mrs. Calloway said without looking up from the bread she was slicing, "this is Miss Edith Bishop, our new schoolteacher. Miss Bishop, Clark Barnett. He works out at the Rafter M Ranch but boards here in town during the week." "Miss Bishop," he said, and nodded at her with a naturalness that she found unexpectedly easy to receive. "Mr. Barnett," she said, and reached for the pitcher of water. He did not try to fill the silence that followed, and she appreciated that about him immediately. Too many men she had known felt that silence was something to be fixed rather than something to be respected. Clark Barnett let it exist while he loaded his plate with Mrs. Calloway's roast chicken and biscuits, and the meal continued around them, and Edith found herself watching him twice during the supper, and both times he was already looking somewhere else, which she told herself meant nothing. She spent the first week in Colton Creek, learning the shape of her situation. The schoolhouse was being rebuilt by a small crew of men, and the timeline was vague in the way that all timelines in small Texas towns were vague. Harold Pratt estimated 4 weeks. The foreman of the construction crew said 6. Mrs. Calloway, who had lived in Colton Creek for 30 years, told Edith to assume 8 and to find something useful to do in the meantime. So Edith did. She offered to tutor children at the boarding house in the evenings, and 3 families took her up on it. She helped Mrs. Calloway with correspondence, because the older woman's reading glasses were badly scratched, and she had not yet gotten around to replacing them. She walked the town every morning before the heat became unbearable, and she learned where the post office was, and which clerk at the general store would give her a fair price on supplies, and which one would try to talk her into buying more than she needed. She did not speak much to Clark Barnett during those first days. He came and went at odd hours, leaving before dawn some mornings when he had an early ride to the ranch, returning at supper still carrying the outdoors with him. He was not unfriendly. He asked her once, on the second day, how she was settling in, and she told him she was managing, and he nodded as though managing was the correct answer. On the 3rd evening he arrived at supper with a small tear in his shirt, and spent the meal trying not to draw attention to it, which she noticed and said nothing about, and the following morning she left a needle and thread on the table where he customarily sat for breakfast, tucked under the edge of his coffee cup so it would not blow away. She was out on her morning walk before he came down. When she returned an hour later, the needle and thread were gone and a small piece of paper was in their place, on which someone had written, in a hand that was careful but not elegant, "Thank you, Miss Bishop." She folded the note and put it in the pocket of her dress and did not examine why she kept it there for the rest of the day. On her 9th morning in Colton Creek, she walked farther than usual, past the cattle pens and out toward the edge of where the town's properties ended and the open range began. She wanted to think, and thinking required space, and Missouri had given her creeks and forests for thinking, but Texas was offering her sky instead, which turned out to be an adequate substitute. She stood at a wooden fence post and looked out at the land stretching away from her in every direction, and tried to talk herself into being content. She was so absorbed in this project that she did not hear the horse until it was quite close, and she startled and stepped back when it appeared at the edge of the tree line to her right, a big gray quarter horse moving at an easy walk with Clark Barnett in the saddle. He pulled up when he saw her and touched the brim of his hat. "Morning," he said. "Didn't mean to sneak up on you." "You didn't sneak," she said. "I was distracted." "Good view for distraction," he agreed, looking out at the same flat golden expanse she had been staring at. "You walk this far every morning." "This is the farthest I have gone," she admitted. "I find I need the air." He looked down at her from the saddle with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between curiosity and consideration, as if he were turning something over in his mind before deciding whether to say it aloud. "There's a better view about a mile north," he said, "up on the ridge. You can see the whole valley when the light's right. Early morning is best." "How early?" she asked. "About the time you're usually out walking," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made her suspect he had noticed when she left the boarding house in the mornings, which meant he had been paying more attention than he let on. "Perhaps I will find it," she said. "At the second fence post," he said. "Follow the dry creek bed until it bends. You'll see the rock formation. Can't miss it." He touched his hat again and moved the gray horse forward, and she watched him ride out into the open land with a looseness in the saddle that spoke of many years spent there, as natural as water in a river, and she thought about the ridge for the rest of the day. She went the next morning, and he had been right. The view from the ridge was everything the flat expanse below was not. You could see the whole of the valley laid out like a cloth on a table, the town a collection of small shapes at its center, the ranch land spreading out on every side, and the sky overhead so wide it felt personal, like it was specifically above you and no one else. She sat on a flat rock near the top and watched the sun come properly up for the first time since she had arrived in Texas, and she thought that this one moment had been worth the journey. She did not expect Clark to be there. But he was, sitting on a rock about 20 feet farther along the ridge, looking out at the same view with a cup of coffee in his hand that he had apparently carried up from somewhere. He looked over when he heard her boots on the stone and gave her a single unhurried nod, as though they had agreed to meet here and she was right on time. "You found it," he said. "You were right," she said. "It's remarkable." "I come up here sometimes," he said simply, "when I need to think." She settled onto her own flat rock, a respectful distance from him, and they sat together in silence for a long time, which ought to have been awkward and was not, in the same way that two people sitting in a library are not awkward together even if they never speak. The sun moved. The valley below them came into color slowly, the gold and brown of it turning warm and specific, the town waking up in small visible movements. A rider left a ranch to the north. Smoke came from the general store's chimney. "You're not from Texas," Clark said eventually. "Missouri," she said. "You?" "Born here," he said. "North of here, up near Abilene. My father had a ranch, sold it when I was 17. "And you went to work on someone else's," she said, not meaning it as any kind of accusation, just as a logical continuation of the sentence. "I did," he said, and there was no defensiveness in it. "I've been at the Rafter M 6 years, foreman now." She looked at him, reassessing slightly. Foreman at 30 meant something. It meant he had earned the trust of the men above him and the respect of the men below him, which was a harder thing to earn than most people acknowledged. "Do you intend to have your own ranch someday?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I've been saving toward it, 3 years, maybe 4. There's a parcel of land west of here that belongs to old Elias Crane. He's talked about selling. Good water, good grass." She nodded and looked back at the valley. "Missouri is flatter," she said, "but there were more trees. Do you miss it?" She considered the question honestly. "I miss the version of it that existed before my father died," she said. "The version after that is less worth missing." He did not offer sympathy in the way people usually did, with noise and assurances. He just looked at her with an expression that said he understood that some things were true and did not require a response, and she felt, in that moment, understood in a way she had not felt in a long time. They walked down from the ridge separately, him going toward the livery to collect his horse, her going back toward the boarding house, and they did not make any arrangement to return the following morning, but they both went back, and they both knew the other would be there, and neither of them said anything about it. This continued for 2 weeks. Every morning, the ridge. Coffee that Clark produced from a small tin pail and poured into 2 cups that he had started bringing along, and the wide, quiet sky of early Texas morning, and conversations that grew in length and depth the way fires grow when you add the right kind of wood. She learned that he had a younger sister in San Antonio who wrote him letters he answered promptly and valued enormously. He learned that she had loved her father with the particular intensity of a child who had known from an early age that one parent was entirely enough. She told him about her students in Missouri, the ones she had taught informally at the county schoolmaster's side, the small, serious faces of children who were hungry to know things. He told her about the cattle drives he had been on before he became foreman, the weeks of riding and dust, and a particular night in Kansas when a storm had come in so fast and so hard that 1,500 head of cattle had scattered into the dark, and they had spent 3 days finding them all again. They were careful with each other in a way that was not dishonest but was cautious, the way people are careful with good things they are not yet certain they are allowed to have. On a Tuesday evening in mid-September, 3 weeks into her time in Colton Creek, Edith came back from tutoring the Henderson children to find a commotion at the far end of the main road. A crowd had gathered outside the Red Lantern Saloon, and men's voices were raised in the way that meant something had gone wrong. She stopped and asked a woman on the sidewalk what had happened. "Fight," the woman said. 3 men from the Dunmore outfit had too much whiskey and went at each other. Edith watched from a distance and then turned back toward the boarding house, because saloon fights were not her concern, only to find that they had become somewhat her concern when she reached Mrs. Calloway's porch and found Clark there, sitting in the rocking chair with a cloth pressed against his left temple and a cut above his eye that was bleeding more than a little. "What happened?" she demanded, forgetting to be composed about it. "Got in the middle of something I shouldn't have," he said, and it came out with a slightly lopsided quality that suggested his jaw was sore. "Clark Barnett," she said, and she used his full name the way women used full names when they meant business, and she sat down in the chair beside him and held out her hand for the cloth. He gave it to her, and she examined the cut with a directness that seemed to take him off guard. "It needs to be cleaned properly," she said. "Come inside." He followed her inside without arguing, which surprised her and apparently surprised him too, because he looked mildly unsettled by his own compliance. She sat him at the kitchen table under the lamp and found Mrs. Calloway's medicine cabinet, which contained carbolic acid, clean cloth, and a bottle of whiskey that was clearly kept there for medicinal purposes only, and she cleaned the cut with a thoroughness that made him go very still. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I'm aware," she said, pressing clean cloth against the cut and watching to make sure the bleeding was slowing. "Who were the 3 men?" "Dunmore outfit," he said. "They came in drunk and started in on a boy from the rafter, one of our youngest hands. He's 16, didn't deserve what they were giving him." She looked at him for a moment. "And so you stepped in." "Somebody had to," he said. She considered that and pressed the cloth a little more firmly, and he winced, and she said, "Hold still," and he held still. "Is the boy all right?" she asked. "Scared but fine," he said. "I sent him back to the ranch." She finished cleaning the cut and sat back in her chair, and looked at him in the warm kitchen light with his cut temple and his steadfast expression, and thought, clearly and without any particular drama, that she was falling in love with this man, and that it was going to be one of the more inconvenient truths of her adult life. She handed him a fresh cloth to hold to his temple and stood up and began putting the medical supplies away. "You should sleep," she said. "That cut will be sore by morning." "I'm usually sore by morning regardless," he said, and she laughed before she could stop herself, and he looked at her with something warm and startled in his eyes, as if her laugh was something he had not been prepared for and very much wanted to hear again. The schoolhouse was finished on the 1st of October, which was 1 week later than Harold Pratt's most optimistic estimate and 2 weeks earlier than Mrs. Calloway's. It was a clean, simple structure with 4 windows and a good wood stove and 30 desks arranged in rows. And when Edith walked into it for the first time on the Monday morning of her first week of school, she felt something inside her settle into place the way a compass needle settles north. The children arrived at 8 in the morning, 22 of them ranging from age 6 to 15, and they were various degrees of excited, skeptical, and reluctant, in the way that children always were on the first day of a new school with a new teacher. She had written the day's plan in neat letters on the board behind her desk, and she stood at the front of the room and looked at them all and said, "Good morning. I am Miss Bishop. Before we begin, I would like each of you to tell me one thing you find interesting in this world. It can be anything. We'll start at the left and work our way around." The room went quiet with the weight of being asked something they had not expected, and then a small girl in the front row said, tentatively, "Stars," and Edith said, "Excellent choice," and the ice broke. She was a natural teacher. She had always known this about herself, but it was good to have it confirmed in the particular way that a classroom confirmed it. The specific feeling of 22 faces turning toward her with attention, and the knowledge that she had earned that attention honestly. She was firm and she was fair and she was not above humor when the moment called for it. And by the end of the first week, she had the names and the individual circumstances of all 22 children memorized with precision. She told Clark about the first week at breakfast on Saturday morning, and he listened with the quality of attention he gave to everything she said, which was complete and unperformative, and asked questions that showed he had actually processed what she was telling him rather than simply waiting for a pause to speak. "The Henderson boy," he said, "the one you tutored before the school opened. Is he keeping up?" "He is ahead of where I expected," she said. "He reads very well for 12. But he doesn't believe it yet. Boys that age rarely believe anything good about themselves," Clark said, with a tone that suggested personal experience. "Were you that way?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "My father wasn't much for telling a boy he was doing well," he said. "You sort of learn to read it from other things." "From what things?" she asked. "From whether the cattle came in right," he said. "From whether the fence held, from the work." She looked at him and felt the familiar ache of recognizing something painful that had been absorbed into something sturdy, and she said, "You're good at the work." He looked up at her then, and the way he looked at her had changed from how he had looked at her 3 weeks ago, because something between them had been building so steadily and so quietly that it was now impossible to pretend it was not there, and they both knew it. And they sat across from each other at Mrs. Calloway's breakfast table, while the morning light came through the east window, and neither of them said the thing they were thinking. It was the first Saturday in October when things shifted. Clark had asked her, the previous evening, if she would like to ride out with him on Saturday morning to see the parcel of land west of town that belonged to Elias Crane. He had said it casually, as if it were simply an invitation to look at land, and she had said yes just as casually, as if it were simply an interest in geography. Mrs. Calloway had watched them both from behind her embroidery and said nothing, which was how she communicated that she had understood the situation perfectly. Clark saddled his gray horse and borrowed a gentle roan from the livery for Edith, and they rode out of Colton Creek in the cool early morning, with the sky still pink at the edges, and the scrub grass silver with dew. She had ridden in Missouri, not extensively but enough to be comfortable, and she settled into the saddle with a confidence that made him nod with approval when he glanced over at her. They rode mostly in the easy silence they had developed over weeks of mornings on the ridge, though the landscape around them was different now, moving rather than stationary, the terrain changing as they pushed west. He pointed things out as they rode. A hawk circling over the far eastern corner of the Rafter M, a place in the dry creek bed where water still ran underground and would come up in spring. A stand of cottonwood trees that meant good soil below. He was showing her things he loved about this land, she realized, without calling them that. They arrived at the Crane parcel about an hour after leaving town. It was a broad, gently sloping section of land with a natural hollow in its center, where a creek ran clear and cold over smooth rocks, and good grass on the higher ground, and a stand of live oaks along the southern edge that would provide shade for animals in summer and windbreak in winter. It was beautiful in a way that was entirely practical and entirely real. Not beautiful in the manner of paintings, but beautiful in the manner of something that worked the way it was supposed to. Clark got down from his horse at the edge of the creek and stood looking at it with his thumbs hooked in his belt and a specific expression on his face that she recognized now as his thinking expression, the one he wore on the ridge in the mornings when he was being quiet with something important. Edith dismounted and stood beside him and looked at the creek. "It's good land," she said. "The best I've found," he said. "How close are you to being able to buy it?" He looked at her sideways. 2 years, maybe, he said, if Crane holds on to it that long and the price stays where it is. Do you think he will? He said he won't sell to anyone but the right buyer, Clark said. He's 73 and he built that land up from nothing. He wants to know it'll be taken care of. They walked along the edge of the creek in the direction of the oak trees, and the horses followed behind them on loose reins, placid and unhurried. The morning had warmed enough to be comfortable without being hot yet, and the light through the oaks was the particular gold green that light through live oaks always was, and Edith thought that she would like to come back to this place. She thought it without examining the full shape of the thought, and then she examined it, and it opened up into something larger. She would like to come back to this place because it felt like it belonged to something she wanted to be part of. Because when she stood here beside Clark Barnett and looked at this land, the thought of home, which had been an unresolved thing for the past year of her life, settled into a shape she could recognize. She was looking at the water when he spoke. "Edith," he said, and the sound of her first name in his voice was the first time he had used it, and it stopped her completely, because he had a particular way of saying it, like something he had been holding carefully. She turned to look at him. He was standing 3 feet away with his hat in his hand, which he had taken off without her noticing, and his face had lost the foreman's composure that he usually wore and replaced it with something unguarded and direct. "I need to say something," he said, "and I want to say it right, so I'm going to ask you to hear all of it before you answer." "All right," she said. "I have been trying for 3 weeks to find the sensible reason not to tell you what I'm about to tell you," he said, "and I have not found one that holds up. I am not a man who is good with speeches. But I think you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in my 30 years, and I think about being in the same room with you the way I think about needing air, which is to say constantly and without my permission." He stopped, looked at the hat in his hands, looked back at her. "I would very much like to court you properly, Miss Bishop, if you are willing, and I will understand if you are not." Edith looked at him for a long moment in the live oak light, and everything that she had been carefully not saying for 3 weeks rose up in her, with a clarity that was almost physical. "Clark," she said, and now she was the one using his first name for the first time, and she watched him register it. "I have been trying for 3 weeks to find the sensible reason not to say what I'm about to say as well." He was very still. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." Something changed in his face, not dramatically, not in any way that anyone watching would have described as a scene, but it was there. a kind of loosening, like a door that had been shut gently for a long time finally being opened. "Good," he said, and the understatement of it made her smile. He offered her his arm for the walk back to the horses, and she took it, and they rode back to Colton Creek with the morning fully warm around them, and it was not the same as the ride out. They courted with the full formality that 1882 required, and the genuine warmth that their particular situation had built in them over the past weeks. He escorted her to church on Sunday mornings and sat beside her in the pew, and the town of Colton Creek, which noticed everything, noticed this and drew its conclusions. He brought her books from the traveling merchant who came through twice a month, choosing them with a care that suggested he had thought about what she might love to read. She baked him a pie at Mrs. Calloway's kitchen on a Saturday afternoon, apple and brown sugar, because he had mentioned once that it was his mother's recipe. And when she put it on the table at supper, he went very quiet for a moment, and then said it was the best pie he had ever eaten, and she was reasonably certain he was not entirely talking about the pie. He was a good man in the specific, observable way that mattered, not in the abstract ideal that people like to talk about. He was honest in his dealings and considered in his decisions, and he did not say things he did not mean. He treated Mrs. Calloway with genuine respect and was patient with Mrs. Faraday even when she told the same story twice in the same evening. He paid his bills promptly and worked hard without complaining about it, and when one of his ranch hands was injured in late October and could not work, Clark covered the man's obligations and paid him partial wages out of his own savings while the man recovered. Edith learned this last part not from Clark but from Mrs. Calloway, who seemed to have appointed herself a kind of informal accounting office for Clark Barnett's character, reporting his good qualities to Edith in the manner of a woman who wanted to make sure all the relevant information was in the right place. "He has done that sort of thing before," Mrs. Calloway said over the mending one evening. "He never talks about it." "No," Edith said. "He wouldn't." November brought the first cold to Colton Creek, not the brutal cold of a Missouri winter but a sharp, clean chill that came down from the north in the evenings and made the sunsets dramatic and the mornings brisk. Edith's schoolroom required the wood stove now, and one of the older boys had taken on the responsibility of arriving early to get it lit, which he did with the pride of someone who had been given an important task and was going to be absolutely certain it was done correctly every time. She was happy. She had not expected to be happy, or not so quickly, or not in this particular way. The school filled a need in her that was real and deep, and she went to it every morning with energy that did not feel forced. And in the mornings before school and the evenings after it, there was Clark, and whatever it was that was happening between them, which was growing in substance and warmth the way fires grew when you were not watching them too carefully. He kissed her for the first time on a Friday evening in late November, on the porch of the boarding house with the cold air around them, and the stars overhead in the vast Texas way they had of being more stars than seemed reasonable. They had been sitting in the two porch chairs talking about something small, what she could not afterward entirely reconstruct, and he had looked at her in the way he had of looking that meant he was entirely present, and he had leaned forward and she had moved toward him, and it had been the simplest, most unhurried kiss she had ever experienced, careful and warm and exactly right. He pulled back and looked at her and said, "I've been wanting to do that for some time." "Since when?" she asked. He considered. "The morning on the ridge," he said. "The second morning." She laughed, and he smiled at that, and the porch was cold, and neither of them moved to go inside for quite a while longer. December arrived, and with it the preparations for the town's Christmas celebration, which Edith had been enlisted to organize by Harold Pratt on the grounds that she was a schoolteacher, and therefore presumably in possession of organizational abilities. This was true, and she organized the celebration with a thoroughness that surprised the town and delighted the children, who were central to her plan in the way that children were always supposed to be central to Christmas and frequently weren't. She planned a performance on the evening of the 23rd, in which the schoolchildren would present songs and a reading of the Christmas story, and a short play that she had written herself about a young family traveling across the frontier on Christmas Eve. The town turned out for it in numbers that spoke of how hungry a small frontier community was for something shared and lovely, and the schoolroom, packed to its walls with parents and neighbors, was warm from the stove and from the bodies of people who were, for one evening, simply glad to be together. Clark sat in the second row because the front row had been claimed by small siblings of the performers, and Edith could see him from the front of the room where she stood, and he watched the children perform with an expression she filed away carefully in the part of her mind where she kept the things about him she loved most. After it was over and the room was emptying into the cold December night, he found her standing near the stove and said, "You did something good here tonight, Edith." "The children did it," she said. "With your help," he said. She looked at him in the candlelight of the nearly empty schoolroom and felt something so full in her chest that it needed a word bigger than happiness, and she could not immediately locate one. He had brought something, she noticed then. A small, flat package wrapped in brown paper that he was holding in one hand with a casualness that meant he had been trying to decide when to give it to her. "Merry Christmas," he said, and held it out. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a book, a copy of Jane Austen's Persuasion, and inside the front cover he had written, in his careful, not entirely elegant hand, "For the woman who walked up a ridge and found me already there." With all that follows from that, Clark, she read it twice in the candlelight and then pressed the book against her chest and looked at him. "Clark," she said, "it seemed like something you'd like," he said, managing somehow to sound both gruff and thoroughly endeared. "I love it," she said. "I love it very much." She had not been able to get him a gift, she told him honestly, because she did not yet know him well enough to know what to get a man like him, and he said she had about 30 more years to figure that out, and they both stood there for a moment processing what that meant. He had not been speaking idly. January was cold and clear and brought with it the kind of prairie quiet that was either peaceful or maddening depending on a person's relationship with their own thoughts. Edith's relationship with her thoughts was generally good, which meant she found the January quiet productive, and she used the evenings after school and supper to read and plan the spring curriculum and write letters to the few friends she had left in Missouri. She wrote to her friend Agnes, who had known her since childhood, and told her about the school in Colton Creek and Clark Barnett, and Agnes wrote back a letter that was mostly composed of exclamation marks and was clearly very pleased. Edith reread the letter twice and found that she was smiling at Agnes's enthusiasm in a way that confirmed everything she already knew. Clark had begun the process of approaching Elias Crane about the land in a formal way, not yet as a buyer, because he was not ready to buy, but as an interested party who wanted to establish his intentions before someone else did. He had spent one afternoon at the old man's ranch and returned with a handshake agreement that gave him a kind of right of first refusal on the parcel, provided he was ready to buy within 18 months. He told Edith about this at supper that evening, and she could see how much it meant to him from the controlled way he described it, the carefully managed satisfaction of a man who had been working toward something for years and had just taken a significant step forward. 18 months, she said. "That's manageable." "It's tight," he said, "but I think it works. What's the rest of the plan?" She asked, and he looked at her with a slight pause that meant the rest of the plan was something he had not quite finished articulating yet, at least not out loud. "I need to talk to you about the rest of the plan," he said. "All right," she said. He looked at his coffee cup. He had not been this uncertain in his manner since the day by the creek when he had asked to court her, and she read that the same way she had read it then. "The land works better with two people," he said. "A ranch needs a house and a house needs. It's better as I mean to say." He stopped. He was not a man who fumbled for words habitually, and the fumbling now was endearing in a way she hadn't anticipated. He looked at her directly and said, I am trying to ask you to marry me, Edith, and I am making rather a poor job of it." "You are making a fine job of it," she said immediately. "Yes," he blinked. "That was quick." "I have been thinking about it since December," she said. "Since December," he repeated. "Since the book," she said, "with all that follows from that." The silence that followed was the warmest one they had ever shared, which was saying something given the collection of warm silences they had accumulated. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned her palm up and held his back, and Mrs. Calloway appeared in the kitchen doorway, took one look at the two of them and said, "Well, it is about time," and turned back into the kitchen to give them their moment, though she was clearly pleased. They were married in February, in the small church at the end of Colton Creek's main road, on a Saturday when the sky was a fierce, cold blue and the ground was iron-hard, and the live oaks along the edge of town had the stripped, stark beauty of winter trees. The minister was a thin, earnest man named Reverend Hooper, who had a genuine warmth beneath his formality, and the ceremony was attended by Mrs. Calloway and the other boarders, and a collection of townsfolk and ranch hands from the Rafter M, who filled the little church with a friendliness that Edith found moved her more than she expected. She wore a dress of deep green wool that she had made with Mrs. Calloway's help from fabric ordered through the general store. Clark wore his good suit, which was dark and fitted, and revealed that he cleaned up with a distinction that his everyday work clothing did not always suggest. He stood at the front of the church and watched her walk up the aisle with the particular quality of focus he brought to important things, complete and serious and warm all at once, and when she reached him and he took her hand, she felt it all the way through. Reverend Hooper asked his questions and they answered them, and when the rings were exchanged, Clark's hands were steady and hers were only slightly not, and when the minister said he could kiss his bride, Clark took a half-second that was entirely characteristic of him to look at her as though checking that she was ready, and then kissed her in a way that made Mrs. Faraday say afterward that it was the most romantic wedding she had attended in 30 years, which may or may not have been an accurate accounting. They had a wedding supper at Mrs. Calloway's, with the whole dining room commandeered for the purpose, and Mrs. Calloway's best cooking spread across the table in a way that suggested she had been planning this meal for some time. There was roast beef and corn pudding and green beans and biscuits and 3 kinds of pie, including apple. Clark ate 2 slices of the apple pie with a deliberateness that made Edith smile across the table. They had arranged to stay at the boarding house through the end of the school year, because it made no sense for Edith to leave her position when the schoolhouse was in its first year, and the children depended on continuity, and Clark could still ride to the Rafter M from town without difficulty. The Crane land would come at the end of summer, and they would build their house in the fall. It was a practical arrangement and also a loving one, because it gave them the luxury of beginning their married life in the familiar surroundings where they had found each other, in Mrs. Calloway's warm house with its cedar smell and excellent cooking, and it turned out that sharing a room with Clark Barnett was as natural as everything else about him, easy and unforced, a continuation of the conversation they had been having since the first morning on the ridge. Spring came in March, early and warm, and Edith's school thrived into the season the way it had thrived through the winter. She had begun a garden project with the older students, a practical one, because she believed in practical education, and because several of the children came from families that could benefit from knowing what to grow and how to grow it. They cleared a patch of ground behind the schoolhouse and planted it with care, and the whole enterprise had the additional benefit of giving the class something to come in every morning excited about. She wrote to Agnes that she had never felt so purposeful in her life, and that was the truth, because she had 2 things she loved, her work and her husband, and they fed each other in the way that good things did, one making her larger for the other. Clark was well in the spring. He was happy in a way that was visible to everyone who knew him, though he would not have described it in those terms. The Rafter M owner, a hard but fair man named George Aldridge, had given Clark a raise in January and told him that he was the best foreman the ranch had ever had, which Clark had received with the characteristic modesty of a man who knew his own worth but saw no reason to advertise it. He was counting money carefully and watching the Crane parcel, and planning a future in the specific and detailed way he planned everything. There was one complication that arrived in April, in the form of a man named Wade Dunmore, who rode into Colton Creek on a Tuesday afternoon looking for trouble of a very particular kind. Dunmore was the owner of the largest ranch operation in the county, a man in his late 50s with a fondness for land acquisition, and a habit of getting what he wanted through means that were not always strictly legal. He had been in a long, slow dispute with Elias Crane over water rights on the western edge of the old man's property, and when word got out that Elias had made a gentleman's agreement with Clark Barnett to sell, Dunmore arrived in town to register his displeasure. He did not come to Clark directly, which would have been at least straightforward. He went to the land office and attempted to file a competing claim on the Crane parcel based on an old and questionable survey, and he went to Elias Crane himself with an offer that was higher than Clark could match, and carried with it the kind of pressure that old men who lived alone were susceptible to. Clark heard about it on a Wednesday evening from one of the Rafter M. hands, who had ridden past the Crane property and seen Dunmore's wagon there. He came home to the boarding house that evening with the composed expression he used when he was managing something difficult, and told Edith about it at the small table in their room after supper while the evening settled outside the window. She listened all the way through. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "Go see Elias myself," he said. "Tomorrow morning before anyone else gets to him. Our agreement was made in good faith by a man whose word I trust. I need to know if Dunmore's offer has changed things." "Do you trust him?" she asked. "Elias?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "He's old but he's not weak, and he knows what Dunmore is." "Then go see him," she said. "But Clark, be careful. Wade Dunmore is not a man who accepts a no gracefully." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "he is not, but Elias' land is his to sell to whoever he chooses, and I will not be the kind of man who wins by any method other than the right one." She reached across the small table and put her hand over his. "I know," she said. "That's not what I meant. I meant watch your back on the road." He went the next morning, and Edith taught her school day with the particular alertness of someone who had left something important unresolved at home. He returned that afternoon, and she saw him ride back up the main road from the classroom window, sitting easy in the saddle and not fast, which meant it had gone well enough. He came by the schoolhouse at the end of the day when the children had gone. "Elias held his ground," he said. "Dunmore's offer was higher, but Elias told him the land wasn't for sale to men who couldn't be trusted with it. Those were his words. He said our agreement stands." She let out a breath she had been holding since morning. "Good, Dunmore's not finished," Clark said, "but the agreement is solid and Elias has it in writing now. I had the sheriff witness it this afternoon." "You thought ahead," she said. "You taught me that," he said, which was only partly true but which she appreciated. Dunmore made one more attempt, a week later, when one of his men tried to run Clark's horse off the road on the way back from the Crane property. The horse shied and Clark stayed in the saddle, and he rode to the sheriff's office that evening and made a formal complaint, and Sheriff Tanner, who was a solid and uncorruptible man, paid a visit to the Dunmore ranch the following day. Whatever was said there, the interference stopped, and Dunmore's disputed claim at the land office was reviewed and found to be based on a survey that the county land commissioner declared invalid. The spring moved forward, and the complication resolved itself the way that things resolved themselves when the right structures were in place, not dramatically, but reliably. By May, the garden behind the schoolhouse was growing visibly, and the children were fiercely proud of it. Edith had organized the class into small teams, each responsible for a different section of the plot, and the competition between them was entirely friendly and entirely effective. The older children were teaching the younger ones, which was, she knew, one of the most powerful things that could happen in a classroom. She also knew by May that she was pregnant. She was certain before she said anything, certain in the way a woman learned to be certain about her own body, and she waited until she was completely sure, and then told Clark on a Saturday evening when they were alone in their room at Mrs. Calloway's, with the last of the day's light coming through the window in the long, golden way it did in late spring Texas. He went very still when she told him. Not with shock, she could see, but with the kind of stillness that came over him when something was larger than his usual responses could contain. "When?" he asked. "November," she said, "or thereabouts." He reached out and took her hands in both of his, and his face did the thing it had done on the day she said yes to marrying him, the loosening, the opening. "Are you well?" he asked first. "I am perfectly well," she said. "Good," he said, and then quieter, "Good." She watched him absorb it and thought that she had never loved him more than she did in this moment, watching him receive the news of becoming a father with the same steady, serious care he brought to everything that mattered to him. "We need to move faster on the house," he said after a moment. "Yes," she agreed. "I'll talk to Elias about moving up the purchase timeline," he said, "and Aldridge. He might advance me something against next year's wages if I ask." He was already calculating, already planning, and she squeezed his hands. "Clark," she said, "be here for a moment before you start fixing things." He looked at her and then he laughed, a real laugh, one of the ones she had been collecting for months, and he said, "You're right," and pulled her close, and they stayed that way in the evening light for a long while, not talking about timelines or finances, just being the thing they were. Mrs. Calloway's response to the news, shared at breakfast the following morning, was to immediately begin knitting and to declare that the spare room on the second floor would need to be freshened up, as though the baby were going to take up residence at the boarding house, which in a way it would, for a little while. The old woman's happiness was entirely unguarded, and Edith found it enormously touching. Summer came in with its full Texas heat, and the school year ended on the last Friday of May with the garden behind the schoolhouse at the height of its first growth and 22 children, who had learned more than Edith had expected any of them to learn in a first year together. She said goodbye to them with the affection of someone who intended to see them all again in September, because she did intend that, and she walked home from the schoolhouse on that last day of the year with her grade books under her arm and the warm June air around her, and the particular feeling of a task accomplished that had been worth accomplishing. Clark had moved forward on the Crane purchase with the urgency of a man who had two compelling reasons now to get a house built on that land before November. He had spoken to George Aldridge, who had done something more than advance wages. He had offered Clark a partnership stake in a section of the Rafter M's cattle in exchange for staying on as foreman through the following spring. The arrangement gave Clark enough capital to close the deal with Elias Crane and have something left for the house. They signed the papers on the Crane land on the 1st of July, in the county land commissioner's office in Colton Creek, with Elias Crane sitting across the table looking satisfied in the way of a man who had done something exactly right. He shook Clark's hand and then Edith's, and told her that the creek on the western edge was the best cold water in the county, and she should use it for her kitchen, and she would thank him for it. And she told him she was sure she would. The house went up over the course of July and August, which were brutally hot months to be building in, but the crew that Clark assembled were experienced and hardworking, and Clark himself was on the site every day that he was not needed at the Rafter M, working alongside them. Edith came out 2 or 3 times a week in the mornings before the worst of the heat to watch the progress and to make decisions that needed her input, because it was going to be her house as much as his, and she had specific ideas about it. She wanted a wide porch on the east side so they could have morning coffee in the shade. She wanted the kitchen big, with good counter space, because she had decided that she liked cooking and intended to take it seriously. She wanted bookshelves built into the wall of the main room, floor to ceiling, which Clark arranged without comment or question, simply adding it to the carpenter's instructions. She wanted 4 bedrooms because she intended to fill them. He raised an eyebrow at 4 bedrooms. "We're already working on 1, she pointed out, and he looked at her for a moment and then said, 4 bedrooms, to the carpenter. The house was ready in late September, just ahead of Edith's return to school for the 2nd year and far enough ahead of November that they had time to settle in properly. The day they moved their belongings out from Mrs. Calloway's and into the new house was the 1st of October, a year almost to the day since Edith had begun teaching in Colton Creek. The morning was clear and cool, and the cottonwood trees along the creek were turning gold, and when Clark carried the last box through the door and set it in the front room, he turned and looked at her in the light coming through the new windows and said, "This is ours." "It is," she agreed. She pressed her hand flat against the wall beside the door, just once, a claiming gesture, and he saw it and smiled. They moved in and made it theirs, which required the work that all new houses required, the arranging and the hanging and the establishing of where things would go, and it required the particular additional quality of 2 people learning a new space together, which was both practical and intimate in a way she had not anticipated. She filled the bookshelves with what they had, which was not yet enough to fill them, and decided she would consider the empty shelves an investment in future reading. He built a fire in the new fireplace on the first cold evening, and they sat together in front of it in 2 chairs pulled close, and the house held them in a way that felt permanent and chosen. She had been right that it was a good house. It was solid and well-made, and the porch on the east side was exactly what she had wanted, wide and shaded, with a view of the creek bottom through the cottonwoods. The kitchen had the counter space she had asked for and the good light of the south-facing window, and she stood in it on the first morning and made breakfast for 2, and thought that this was a very specific and complete happiness. The school year's second opening was not the uncertain thing the first had been. She walked into the schoolhouse on the first Monday of October as someone who had already proven herself here, and the children who returned were glad to see her, and the new children who came for the first time were quickly brought along by the ones who already knew how things worked in Miss Bishop's, now Mrs. Barnett's, classroom. She kept the name Miss Bishop at school because that was who she was there, the teacher, and she found the distinction comfortable and clean. The fall deepened around them and November arrived, and with it the baby, a boy, born on a cold, clear November morning with the help of Mrs. Calloway, who arrived the previous evening at the first sign that things were beginning and stayed through the night, with the steadiness of a woman who had attended enough births to be calm through all of it. Clark stayed as well, because Edith had told him she wanted him there, and he had stayed, pacing the hallway with a containment that spoke of enormous effort. And when Mrs. Calloway opened the bedroom door at 8 in the morning and told him he had a son, he went still for a second and then moved past her into the room with a speed that was entirely characteristic of him when something important needed his immediate presence. Edith was tired and bright-eyed, and the baby was wrapped in the blanket Mrs. Calloway had been knitting since May, and she held him up so Clark could see him properly. He was round-faced and red and aggressively opinionated about his new situation, which seemed entirely appropriate given his parentage. Clark sat on the edge of the bed and Edith placed the baby in his arms, and the baby immediately stopped complaining and looked up at his father with the focused, slightly suspicious expression of someone encountering a new situation and taking his time about judging it. "Hello," Clark said to the baby, and the word came out rough and he cleared his throat, and Edith watched him look at his son for the first time. "He looks like you," she said. Clark looked up at her. His eyes were bright. "You think so?" "Very much," she said. He looked back at the baby, and something moved across his face that she kept in the most protected part of her collection of moments. His face when he understood for the first time that he was a father, and that the whole shape of everything had just expanded beyond what he had previously mapped. They named him James, after Edith's father, with William after Clark's father's father as the middle name. James William Barnett came home to the house on the Crane land on a cold November afternoon, and immediately made the house feel complete in the way that only the presence of a baby could accomplish, by filling it with noise and need and an absolute, inarguable aliveness. Clark took to fatherhood the way he took to most important things, with seriousness and care, and a willingness to learn what he did not know. He was not afraid of the baby. He held him and rocked him and walked the kitchen with him in the small hours when James was fretful, without complaint and without being asked, because it needed doing and because Edith needed sleep. She woke sometimes in those nights to find him standing by the window in the dark with the baby against his shoulder, talking to him in a low, continuous murmur that was not quite words, and she lay still and listened, and felt the depth of her love for him like something you could measure. She returned to school in January, when James was 2 months old and beginning to understand that the world extended beyond what his immediate senses could confirm. Mrs. Calloway, who had retired from taking on boarders and was spending more and more time at the house on the Crane land anyway, offered to look after James during the school days, and she made this offer with an authority that suggested it was not really an offer so much as an announcement. The arrangement worked beautifully. Mrs. Calloway and James developed an alliance of mutual adoration that was apparently beneficial to both parties. Edith taught with the additional energy of someone who had come back to her work with renewed appreciation for it, and the school in its second year deepened into something that the whole town of Colton Creek had begun to notice and discuss with pride. Spring of 1884 came in warm and early, and found the Barnett household on the Crane land in full, productive flourishing. Clark had established a small herd of cattle on the property, 20 head to begin with, which he managed alongside his continued position as foreman of the Rafter M. The partnership arrangement with Aldridge had worked well for both of them, and there was talk of expanding it. The creek on the western edge of the property had not disappointed, providing the excellent cold water that Elias Crane had promised, and the garden that Edith had established behind the house was already larger than the one behind the schoolhouse had ever been. She planted it in March and tended it in the evenings while James sat in the dirt nearby and investigated it with the intensity of a 9-month-old who had recently discovered that the world was full of interesting textures. Clark came home from the ranch in the evenings to find this scene frequently, his wife in the garden and his son in the dirt, and the whole picture of it so specifically good that he stored it away in whatever part of himself he kept the most important things. He told her one evening in April, sitting on the east porch in the last of the day's warmth with coffee cups on the rail and James asleep inside, that he had not known it could be like this. She asked him what he meant, and he said, the having of things, the actual possession of a life you wanted. He had wanted things before, the land, the work, a future, but he had wanted them in the abstract way of someone who was working toward a goal that existed in theory. He had not understood what it would feel like when the abstract became specific. She understood exactly what he meant, because she had lived the same transformation. She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, and they sat on the porch with the Texas evening coming on around them and the creek audible in the distance, and the house behind them full of the breathing life they had made together. In the summer of 1884, Edith discovered she was pregnant again. She told Clark on the same Saturday evening ritual they had established in the last light in their room, with the same sequence of his stillness and his first question about her health and then his careful reception of the joy of it. August, I think, she said. The school year, he said. I'll manage until May, she said, and come back in September. You don't have to, he said. I know, she said. I want to. And so does Miss Bishop. He smiled at the distinction which he had always understood and appreciated. 4 bedrooms, he said. We're filling them, she agreed. The second year of school concluded in June, and Edith's class had grown to 29 children, and included 2 of the children from the families that farmed the neighboring land to the Barnett property, which gave her a slightly complex feeling about the boundary between school and home that she found in practice not complex at all. The children of their neighbors were the same children she knew from school and from church, and the web of community that made a small town function was something she was increasingly grateful for rather than burdened by. She spent the summer at home, in the garden and with James, who at 9 months old had progressed to pulling himself up on the furniture and regarding the distance between objects with the strategic calculation of a general planning a campaign. He had his father's steadiness and his mother's determination, which everyone who knew both of them noted with varying degrees of delight. Clark finished the fencing on the eastern pasture in July and started a new structure, a proper barn to replace the temporary one they had built in the fall of the previous year. He worked on it on his days from the rafter and in the long summer evenings, and the sound of hammering from the yard was as constant and comfortable as any other sound of the house. Edith brought him water and sometimes sat in the shade of the half-built wall and graded papers from the previous year that she was using to plan the next one, and James crawled around in the dirt nearby, and the afternoons passed in a way that was entirely ordinary and entirely irreplaceable. The baby arrived in August, 2 weeks early, which startled everyone including Mrs. Calloway, who arrived in the same reliable manner she had the first time and managed the situation with the same calm authority. This time Clark did not pace the hallway. He sat at the kitchen table with Mrs. Calloway's previous instruction, which was to stay out of the way and drink his coffee, and he did both with visible effort. A second boy, dark-haired and serious-faced and quieter than his brother had been at the same stage, looking around at everything with large dark eyes that were clearly already trying to make sense of the situation. They named him Samuel, after no one in particular, simply because it suited him in the way that some names suited people immediately and without argument. Samuel John Barnett arrived in the world in August of 1884 and was placed in James's arms, carefully and with supervision on the morning of his second day, and James, who was 9 months old and therefore fully capable of forming opinions, patted Samuel's face with the careful flat palm gesture of someone conducting an inspection. "Gentle," Edith said, guiding his hand. James patted more gently and looked up at his mother for confirmation. "Good," she said. "That's your brother." James looked back at Samuel with the expression of someone who had received information that would require considerable time to fully process. Clark, watching from the doorway with his coffee cup, smiled at his 2 sons and his wife and the house around them, and felt the specific weight of a life that had turned out better than any plan could have predicted. The fall of 1884 brought Edith back to the schoolhouse in September, and Samuel to Mrs. Calloway's care, which the old woman took on with the same passionate commitment she had given to James. The household established a new rhythm to accommodate 2 children, a working husband and a working wife, and the rhythm was complex and occasionally chaotic and entirely manageable because both of them were committed to managing it. Colton Creek itself was growing. The railroad had reached the county seat, 20 miles east, in 1883, and the effects were moving outward like rings in a pond. New families were arriving. New businesses were setting up. The school population had already increased by 1/3 since Edith's first year, and Harold Pratt had come to her in August with the not entirely surprising news that the town was considering expanding the schoolhouse to accommodate a second classroom and potentially hiring an assistant teacher. She told him she thought it was an excellent idea and asked to be involved in selecting the assistant, which he agreed to immediately in the manner of a man who had learned that Edith Bishop, or rather Mrs. Barnett, was going to be involved regardless, and it was better to agree up front. She conducted the interviews herself, in the schoolhouse on a Saturday in September, and hired a young woman named Clara Whitfield, who had come west from Kentucky with genuine credentials and a sensible, warm manner that Edith judged correctly would work well with the younger children. Clara was 22 and single, and was immediately adopted by Mrs. Calloway as a third honorary grandchild, which seemed to suit everyone involved. The expanded schoolhouse was built over the winter and ready in February of 1885, and the population it served was not the 22 children of Edith's first year but 41, and growing. She stood in the larger room on the first morning of its use, and felt the specific satisfaction of someone who had built something that outlasted its beginning, the satisfaction of a thing that continued to grow after the initial effort. James turned 2 in November of 1884 and began speaking with an enthusiasm and specificity that confirmed every suspicion Edith had formed about his character. He had Clark's practicality and his mother's way with words, which turned out to be a combination that expressed itself as a very small person who asked exact questions and expected useful answers. Samuel, at 5 months, was watching his older brother with the studious attention of someone taking notes. Clark's cattle operation had expanded through the fall and winter. He had built the herd to 60 head and fenced the full eastern pasture, and had begun the conversation with Aldridge about eventually buying out his partnership stake and establishing the Barnett Ranch as a fully independent operation. It was not yet the time for that, but the conversation had happened, which meant the time was coming. He told Edith about it on the east porch on a February evening when the boys were asleep, and the night was cold and clear, and the stars over Texas were doing their habitual thing of being more stars than seemed strictly necessary. She listened to the whole plan and asked the questions that needed asking, the financial ones and the practical ones, and then she told him she thought it was the right next step, and that they could make the numbers work, and he sat with that for a moment and said that he didn't know what he would do without her reading the situation alongside him. She told him she intended to be reading it alongside him for a very long time yet, and he said he was counting on that, and the night around them was cold and quiet and entirely sufficient. Spring came to the Crane land, which they had taken to calling the Barnett land now, not in any formal way, but simply in the way that things become named after the people who love them. The garden behind the house was expanded and planted in March, and James helped with the planting in the way of a toddler who helped, which was to say, he participated enthusiastically and distributed seeds in a manner that was creative rather than precise. But the enthusiasm was genuine, and that mattered. Samuel sat in a basket in the shade of the porch and watched all of this with his characteristic serious attention, and Mrs. Calloway sat in a chair beside him and knitted, and gave a running commentary on the garden proceedings that was addressed equally to Samuel and to the garden itself. The year moved forward in the way that good years moved, with ordinary days that accumulated into something irreplaceable. Clark bought Aldridge's cattle partnership and formally registered the Barnett Ranch with the county in May of 1885, which required a trip to the county seat and a considerable amount of paperwork. And when it was done and they had the certificate in hand, Edith held it and read it and said, "Barnett Ranch, established 1885, and handed it back to him, and he went and found a frame for it from the dry goods store and hung it in the front room between the bookshelves. She stood back and looked at it on the wall and felt the full circle of it, from the dusty stage platform in 1882, and the woman with green eyes and a carpet bag, and no money and considerable determination, to here. Here was a house on good land with a creek in the cottonwoods and 2 boys asleep upstairs, and a man who had said he thought about being in the same room with her the way he thought about needing air, and had meant every word of it. She thought about Agnes back in Missouri, and sat down at the kitchen table that evening, and wrote her the kind of letter she had not written before, the kind that tried honestly to convey what had happened, the full arc of it from the beginning to where she was now. She wrote about the ridge and the mornings and the apple pie, and the book with its inscription, and the wedding and the land and the boys, James with his precise questions and Samuel with his watchful eyes, and Clark, who was at the end of the day still the most straightforward and genuine person she had ever encountered, and who made everything around him better simply by being in it and taking it seriously. Agnes wrote back 3 weeks later with a letter that was longer than usual and which concluded with, "You have always been braver than you knew, Edith. I am so glad the West was worth the bravery. Come visit someday when you can and bring all of them." Edith kept that letter with the needle and thread note she had kept from the first week, and the folded paper that said "Thank you, Miss Bishop," in Clark's careful hand. She kept them all in a box in the drawer of her bedside table, the small pieces of the story's beginning. She thought, sometimes, about the woman who had stepped off that stage in 1882 with her green eyes and her fire and her uncertainty and her one trunk and her carpetbag. And she thought that if she could tell that woman one thing, she would tell her. The ridge is north, and the view is worth the climb. And the man who is already there is the one you've been looking for. The summer of 1885 was the best summer the land had seen since they had been on it. Good rain in June and warm, dry days through July and August that made the grass grow thick, and the cattle fat, and the garden behind the house produce, in quantities that Edith began sharing with neighbors because there was more than they could use. She put up preserves for the winter with Mrs. Calloway's guidance and her own learning, and the kitchen in August smelled of the boiling fruit and sugar in a way that made the whole house feel provided for. James, who was nearly 2, became convinced that summer that every living creature on the property was his particular responsibility, and he pursued this conviction with a thoroughness that required Clark to add a latch to the barn door after the incident with the chickens. Samuel, nearly 1, was pulling himself up and making genuine efforts at walking, which James supervised with the authority of someone who had been walking for a year and was considered an expert. Clark watched his sons at the end of August evenings with an expression that Edith had learned to recognize, the one that was the outward sign of a man actively registering that his life was exactly what he wanted it to be. She recognized it because she wore it herself, perhaps less visibly but just as consistently. On the last Sunday evening of August, they sat on the east porch while the boys were in bed and the creek moved in the cottonwoods below, and the summer dark came on slowly and warm. Clark had his coffee and she had her tea, and the persuasion book was in her lap, which she had read 4 times by now, and the bookshelves inside were no longer half empty. He was quiet for a while, looking out at the property, and then he said, "We did all right." She looked at him. He had the particular quality of a man making an assessment he had been thinking about and had decided was fair. "We did," she agreed. "More than all right," he said, and the way he said it was almost shy, which she found endearing in a man of his steadiness. "Very considerably more than all right," she said. He looked at her with the directness he had always had, the complete and unperformative kind, and said, "I am very glad you got off that stage." She laughed. "I am very glad I answered the advertisement," she said. "Do you remember the first morning on the ridge?" he said. "You were already there when I arrived." "You said nothing about arriving second," she pointed out. "I didn't mind," he said. "You looked like you belonged there." She closed the book in her lap and looked at the dark land stretching out from their porch, the property they had signed for together and were making into something real and lasting, and felt everything that the 3 years since the stage platform had given her, and felt it to be more than she had known to ask for. "Clark," she said. He said. "I'm expecting again," she said. He turned to look at her, and the stillness came over him in the familiar way, and then the warmth, and then he said, as he always said first, "Are you well?" "Perfectly well," she said. He reached over and took her hand where it lay on the book, and they sat together on the east porch of the house on the Crane land, which was the Barnett land now, with the creek in the cottonwoods and the late summer dark and the 2 boys asleep inside and all that lay ahead of them. And it was, in every particular, enough. It was, in every particular, exactly right. The woman who had stepped off the stage with fire in her eyes and the man who had been sitting on the ridge waiting, without knowing it, had found what they had not known to name, and had built it into something that would outlast the searching and the uncertainty and the long road west, built it with their hands and their work and their particular, stubborn, genuine love. And it stood around them on the Texas land in the warm dark of a summer evening, solid and real and completely, fully, and at last home.